The 3-year-old girl stood frozen in the hallway, her tiny hand gripping the fabric of her blue dress. She had been standing there for a long time, long enough that her small legs had started to ache. But she didn't move. She couldn't, because behind that closed door, her mother was crying again. Emma had learned to recognize the sound months ago. It wasn't loud. It never was. It was the kind of crying that happened in short, ragged breaths, muffled against a sleeve or a towel, swallowed back down before it could escape into the open air. The kind of crying that was never supposed to be heard by anyone. But Emma heard it. Every time. And today, for the first time, she wasn't alone. Lorenzo Duca had been walking the second-floor hallway with his usual unhurried stride, a stack of papers tucked under one arm, when he saw her. The little housekeeper's daughter, standing like a statue outside the laundry room door, her ear turned toward the wood, her body so still she might have been carved from stone. He slowed, then stopped. Something about the way she stood there, the careful stillness, the way her small hands pressed flat against her thighs, told him this wasn't a child playing a game. This was a child keeping watch. When she finally turned and looked up at him, her eyes were enormous, dark, serious in a way that made his chest tighten. "Mr. Duca," she whispered. Not a question, a statement. Like she'd been waiting for him to arrive, she stepped forward and took his sleeve, pulled him gently away from the door, toward the corner of the hallway near the window. And he followed. He didn't ask why. He just followed, because something in her face told him that asking would only make it harder. "Mommy hides in small places," Emma said when they were far enough. Her voice was so quiet he had to lean down to hear it. "The laundry room, the pantry, sometimes the car. She goes in and cries for a little while. Then she wipes her face and comes out and thinks I don't know. But I always know." Lorenzo lowered himself to one knee. The papers slid from under his arm and scattered across the floor. He didn't notice. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. "Many months," she said. "Since the summer, I think. But it happens almost every day now." He looked toward the closed door, then back at her. "I will wait here with you," he said quietly. "We will not knock. We will wait until she is ready to come out on her own." The little girl nodded. Something in her small shoulders eased, the particular visible relief of a child who had been carrying a weight alone for far too long. They stood together in the hallway, the most powerful man in New Haven and a 3-year-old girl in a blue dress, and neither of them made a sound. 15 minutes passed. Outside, the afternoon light shifted from gold to something softer. Somewhere in another wing of the house, a clock struck the quarter hour. Then the laundry room door opened. Sophia stepped out with the careful composure of a woman who had spent the past 15 minutes rebuilding her face, something she had done so many times it had become a ritual. Her eyes were faintly red at the edges, a redness she'd tried to erase with cold water at the sink inside. She'd pressed the sleeve of her uniform against her cheeks one final time before turning the handle. She was walking with her head slightly down, adjusting the collar of her blouse, and she didn't see them at first. Then she looked up and froze. The color drained from her face so fast it was like watching a light go out. "Mr. Duca," she said, and the apologies began before he could even respond. "I am so sorry. I did not realize you were. I did not mean to. Please forgive me, sir. I did not mean to trouble you. I am so sorry." "Sophia," he said gently, "it is nothing, sir. Truly. Just a small misunderstanding earlier with Miss Isabella. Nothing important. I should not have. I am fine now. I am completely fine. Please do not concern yourself." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched the small things she didn't know she was doing. The quick pass of her hand across her cheek. The way her eyes stayed fixed on the floor near his shoes. The way her body shifted, almost without thinking, so that Emma was moved gently behind the line of her hip, tucked out of sight. A mother's reflex. A woman who had learned somewhere along the way that her child needed to be kept behind her whenever a powerful man was speaking. Every one of those small movements said something her mouth was refusing to say. "I don't believe you," Lorenzo said quietly. "Sophia, go. Take the rest of the afternoon. You don't need to explain anything to me right now. That is not a request." "Sir, please, I can still finish these." "Sophia, rest." She hesitated for one breath. Then she nodded, whispered another apology she couldn't quite stop herself from offering, and turned toward the servant staircase. Emma looked up at Lorenzo. He held out his hand. She took it. Together, in silence, They walked down the hallway toward the wide back stairs that led out to the garden. The garden behind the estate stretched wide and quiet under the late afternoon light. At the far end of the stone path, beneath the low-hanging branches of an old linden tree, there was a small iron bench where the household staff sometimes sat during their breaks. Lorenzo led Emma there without speaking. He lifted her gently onto the bench, then sat down beside her at a respectful distance, the way a man sits beside a witness who has come to tell him something difficult for a long moment. The little girl only watched the leaves. Then, in a voice quieter than her usual voice, but somehow steadier, she began to speak. "Miss Isabella does not like Mommy," Emma said. "She yells at her almost every day. She makes it look like Mommy did something bad. But Mommy didn't do anything." Lorenzo didn't interrupt. He didn't lean in. He simply listened. 2 weeks ago, Miss Isabella took her red wine glass. She looked around first to see if anyone was watching. Then she tipped the glass onto the white carpet in the sitting room on purpose. I saw her. Then she called Mommy, and she said Mommy had been careless, and she made Mommy clean it for a long time. Mommy said sorry many times, even though it wasn't her. She paused, twisted a small button on the front of her dress. Last Thursday, Miss Isabella made Mommy clean the same corner of the hallway 7 times. Mommy counted. I counted with her, but only in my head so Miss Isabella wouldn't hear me. 7 times. Lorenzo repeated quietly, "Yes. 7. The little girl was silent again. She was gathering herself for the part that was harder. When Miss Isabella comes very close to Mommy's face, she whispers things. I can't hear all of them because she whispers, but sometimes I hear a little. She calls Mommy names. Bad names. She said Mommy is a cheap kind of woman. She said Mommy doesn't deserve to walk in this house. She said other things I don't want to repeat because Mommy said good little girls don't repeat ugly words." Lorenzo closed his eyes for a single breath, and every time, Emma went on. "When Miss Isabella walks away, Mommy goes and hides. In the laundry room. In the storage pantry near the kitchen. Once in the car in the driveway. She stays for a little while. She cries very quietly. Then she washes her face, and she comes out, and she smiles at me, and she pretends nothing happened. How long has this been happening, Emma? Since a long time ago. Since before the summer." She lowered her voice further and looked up at him for the first time. "Mommy told me I must not tell anyone, sir. She said if I tell anyone, she will lose her job. She said we don't have anywhere else to go. That is why I didn't tell before. But then it kept happening, and I got scared." That night, long after the household had gone to sleep, Lorenzo went down alone. That the security room was located at the far end of the basement, behind a steel door that opened only to his hand and to the hand of Marco, the head of security, who had served the family for 20 years. Lorenzo walked the length of the corridor without turning on the overhead lights. Only the small pale strip along the floor showed him the way. When he pushed open the door, Marco was already there, standing at attention beside the long console of monitors. "Sir, you asked to see me at midnight. I want everything from the past 3 months," Lorenzo said quietly. "Every camera, every angle, anywhere Sophia has worked, anywhere Isabella has walked. I want to see all of it. Start from the oldest and move forward." Marco didn't ask why. He only nodded once, sat down at the console, and began to bring the footage onto the largest screen. Lorenzo watched. At first, without expression. Then, slowly, with something colder tightening across his jaw, that he watched a morning in early June. Isabella entering the sitting room alone, walking to the low table where a crystal vase held white lilies. She looked around. She looked again. Then, with a movement so deliberate it could not have been mistaken for anything else, she pushed the vase off the edge of the table. It shattered on the marble. She stepped back. Then she called out for Sophia in a voice that was already sharp with false anger. He watched a Tuesday in July. Isabella standing very close to Sophia's face in the corner of the dining room, close enough that their foreheads almost touched. Isabella's lips moving in a rapid low whisper. The camera microphones couldn't fully catch the words. Sophia's face going pale, her hands trembling at her sides. Isabella smiling faintly, then walking away. He watched an evening in August. Sophia standing with her head bowed in the front hallway, hands folded together in front of her, absorbing something Isabella was saying. Then 10 minutes later, on a different camera, Sophia stepping into the small laundry room at the end of the second-floor hallway and pulling the door closed behind her. Then 10 minutes after that, the same door opening, and Sophia stepping out with her eyes carefully dry. Her collar adjusted. Her face rebuilt. Again. And again. And again. Weeks of it. Months of it. A pattern that repeated itself with such consistency that any reasonable person watching it in sequence would have understood within 20 minutes exactly what had been happening inside his house. Lorenzo turned off the screen. He did not move for a long moment. Then he closed his right hand into a fist so tight that the knuckles went white beneath the skin. He held it that way, resting against the edge of the console, until the tendons in his wrist began to ache. The one rule his mother had left him. The one line the Duca family had held for 3 generations. The one thing every soldier under his name knew before they ever took the oath. And it had been broken in his own house. Under his own roof. Every single day for months. By the woman he was going to marry. The order went out before sunrise. By 7 in the morning. Every member of the household and every guard on duty had been called down to the main hall. They stood now in a wide half-circle beneath the crystal chandelier, some still fastening the buttons of their uniforms, none of them speaking. Marco stood at the far end. 2 senior guards flanked the base of the grand staircase. The old cook, the 2 younger housemaids, the driver, the groundsmen who had come in from the greenhouse, the personal attendants, all of them present, all of them waiting, all of them exchanging small, quiet glances that asked what none of them dared to ask aloud. Sophia stood near the back, close to the doorway to the servants' corridor. Her hands folded in front of her apron. Emma pressed against her mother's leg, one small hand gripping tightly to the fabric of Sophia's dress. Neither of them knew why they'd been called. Lorenzo entered from the direction of his study. He was dressed already for the day in a dark charcoal suit, no tie. He crossed the marble floor without hurrying and stopped at the center of the hall beneath the chandelier. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply waited. Then, from the top of the staircase, Isabella appeared. She was still in her silk morning robe, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face soft with sleep. She had clearly been woken by a servant only minutes before and had not yet been told what the gathering was for. She descended the stairs slowly, one hand light on the polished banister, her expression moving from mild irritation into confusion as she took in the size of the crowd below. "Come down, Isabella," Lorenzo said quietly. "Stand here." She hesitated for a single step. Then she came the rest of the way and stopped near the base of the stairs, 3 paces from him. Lorenzo turned to address the room. "I am going to say something once," he said. His voice was low and calm, and it carried into every corner of the hall the way only truly cold voices ever do. Anyone in this house, regardless of rank, regardless of position, regardless of their relationship to me, who dares to bully, insult, or lay a hand on anyone under my protection will pay for it personally in ways they will remember for the rest of their lives. He turned his eyes directly to Isabella. Her face went white. Her lips parted, then closed. A small tremor passed through her jaw. She couldn't hold his gaze for more than a breath. Then he walked forward, past her, past the front line of the staff, and stopped in front of Sophia. She looked up at him with the specific bewilderment of a woman who had not yet understood that the words had been about her. "Sophia," Lorenzo said, and his voice softened only slightly. "You will continue your work in this house. From this moment forward, no one under this roof is permitted to touch you or your daughter again. Not a hand, not a word. This is an order." Sophia's shoulders began to shake before she could stop them. She lowered her face. The tears came silently. Emma pressed harder against her mother's side. Isabella, at the foot of the stairs, bowed her head. The next afternoon, Isabella came to the small staff room behind the kitchen. She came alone, without a maid, without Lorenzo, without any announcement. She was dressed simply in a soft cream sweater and dark trousers, her hair pulled back with a plain clasp, and her eyes were rimmed with the specific delicate redness of a woman who had been crying for some time before she arrived. She stopped just inside the doorway. Sophia was folding towels at the small table by the window. Emma sat on the floor near her mother's feet, drawing on a piece of paper with a stub of pencil. "Sophia," Isabella said softly. "Please, may I speak with you?" Sophia set the towel down slowly and turned to face her. Isabella crossed the room in 3 uncertain steps, and, before Sophia could react, took her hands. "I have not slept all night," Isabella said. Her voice was low, unsteady, carefully unsteady. "I have been sick with myself. I don't know what came over me these past months. I was jealous. I was foolish. I saw the way Lorenzo trusted you and the way Emma runs to him. And something in me became small and cruel. I did things I cannot take back. There is no excuse. I am so terribly ashamed. Please, please forgive me. I swear to you, on my mother's grave, it will never happen again. She drew Sophia into a light embrace. Sophia did not return it. But she didn't resist it either. She stood inside the arms of the woman who had made her hide in laundry rooms for months, and she said nothing at all. I forgive you, Miss Isabella, Sophia said finally, because in her position, in her house, in her life, there was no other sentence available to her. Isabella pressed a hand to her own chest, murmured her thanks, and left the room as quietly as she had entered. Sophia stood very still for a long time after the door closed. She did not believe a single word of it, but she didn't have the luxury of saying so aloud that night. At 11, Isabella slipped out through the side terrace of her bedroom, wrapped in a dark shawl, and walked the length of the garden path to the greenhouse behind the estate. The glass structure glowed faintly from within, warmed by a single hanging lamp near the workbench. Among the tall white orchids that his grandmother had once planted, a man was waiting for her. His name was Vincent Corsi. He was 45 years old, broad across the shoulders, silver already threading through his dark hair at the temples. He had stood at Lorenzo's side for 15 years, since the year the old Don had died, and there was no man in the world Lorenzo trusted more completely. He had been the boy's protector, the young man's counselor, the grown boss's right hand. Isabella walked into his arms without a word. He caught her against him, and they held each other tightly. Then he kissed her long and slow in the specific way of two people who had been kissing each other for a very long time. Long before Lorenzo had ever placed a ring on her finger, it had been Vincent, in fact, who had first arranged the engagement. Vincent drew back from her slowly, his hand still resting at the small of her back, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has been building for a very long time. You did well this afternoon, he said quietly. The little scene in the staff room. He will hear about it from her by tomorrow morning. He will believe you have learned your lesson. I hated every word of it, Isabella whispered, standing in that little room, holding her hands, apologizing to a housekeeper. You did what was necessary. Nothing more, nothing less. She pulled away from him, wrapped her arms around herself, and walked slowly between two of the tall white orchids toward the workbench. Vincent, we have a problem now. I know. He stood in the main hall this morning in front of every soldier and every servant in the house, and he told them she is under his protection. Do you understand what that means? Every camera, every guard, every ledger will be watched more carefully now. Marco will start asking questions he hasn't asked in years. I know, Isabella. For over 5 years, we have been moving money out of this family. Boston, Miami, Newark, shell companies inside shell companies. Tens of millions of dollars quietly passed through. Accounts opened under the names of distant Rossi cousins who don't even know their signatures exist on paper. Do you know what happens if Marco starts pulling those threads now? Do you know what happens if any one of them comes loose? I know exactly what happens. Then how are you so calm? Vincent walked to the workbench and rested one hand flat against the old wood. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to her, and the smile he gave her was not warmed. Because the problem is not Marco, he said. The problem has never been Marco. Marco does what he is told, and I have been the one telling him for 15 years. The problem is that woman, the housekeeper. She is the reason all of this attention is now being paid to a house that ran quietly for years. She is a servant, Vincent. She scrubs floors. She doesn't read ledgers. She doesn't open safes. She doesn't need to read anything. She only needs to still be here. Isabella looked at him carefully. She had known this man for a long time. She had learned to read the small shifts in his face the way other women learn to read weathered. There is something you aren't telling me. There is a great deal I am not telling you, Vincent said calmly. For your own protection, what you need to know is this. She has to be gone from this house. Not next month. Not next week. This week. Howie gave a public order this morning. Public orders can be turned against the people they were meant to protect. If the reason for her leaving becomes something even Lorenzo cannot defend her against, the order means nothing. What are you planning? Vincent smiled again. This time it was the smile of a man who had already finished the plan and was simply waiting for the calendar to catch up. Something that will be found in her cart, he said. By tomorrow evening. Friday morning arrived clear and cold. Sophia was already at work in the main sitting room by 9:30, on her knees at the corner of the long Persian rug, polishing the low table with a soft cloth in slow, careful circles. Emma sat quietly on the window bench with her small book of drawings, watching the pigeons on the outside sill. The cleaning cart stood in the hallway just beyond the sitting room doorway, tucked against the wall where Sophia had left it, unattended, exactly as she had left every cart every morning for the past 2 years. Vincent had counted on that. He walked the length of the second-floor corridor at 9:47, papers in one hand, exactly as though he were on his way from Lorenzo's study to the main office. When he passed the cart, he didn't stop. He didn't slow. He only bent for a single motion, so smoothly that a camera would have seen only a man adjusting his cuff dot, and in that motion, he slipped into the lower compartment beneath the cart a leather-bound notebook and a small black flash drive. 30 seconds. He kept walking. He didn't look back. The notebook contained the family's private transaction records for the past 3 years. The flash drive contained the names, phone numbers, and payment routes of every business contact the Duca Empire relied on. Both items had been kept locked in the safe of Lorenzo's inner office. Both had been carefully copied in advance so that Lorenzo's originals would remain undisturbed. At 10:17, Vincent stepped into an empty guest bathroom on the 3rd floor, removed a small prepaid phone from his inside pocket, and dialed the security desk. His voice was distorted through a thin cloth pressed against the receiver. "There is someone inside the estate moving documents out. They are going to sell them to the Rossi family. Search everyone now." He ended the call. He crushed the phone under his heel and dropped the pieces into the toilet. By 10:30, Marco had brought the alert to Lorenzo, and Lorenzo had given the order. Every member of the staff was called down to the main hall. Every cleaning cart, every laundry basket, every rolling tray was brought into the center of the marble floor. 24 guards stood along the walls. Isabella came halfway down the staircase and stopped, one hand resting on the banister. Vincent stood at Lorenzo's shoulder, his face composed, his eyes attentive. The search began. Cart after cart was overturned. Nothing. 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 Then they came to Sophia's cart. The lower compartment was opened. The leather notebook slid out first, landing softly on the polished marble. The flash drive tumbled after it and rolled to a stop against the boot of one of the guards. A single sharp intake of breath moved across the entire hall. Emma, standing behind the line of servants, understood before she understood. She burst into tears and ran forward and threw her small arms around her mother's legs. Sophia didn't move. Her face had gone completely white. Her lips were parted around a question she couldn't form. On the staircase, Isabella lifted her hand to her mouth in a small, perfect gesture of shock. Vincent leaned in and whispered something close to Lorenzo's ear. Lorenzo looked at Sophia. His eyes did not accuse her. They were only deeply, quietly, bewildered. The law of the Duca family had been written a long time before Lorenzo was born, and no boss had ever been permitted to bend it, not even for a woman he trusted. Any person found with sealed family documents in their possession was to be isolated for questioning until the matter was resolved. Yet there was no exception for length of service. There was no exception for personal belief. There was no exception for a child in the room. Lorenzo understood the rule better than anyone standing in the hall, because his own father had once enforced it against a cousin, and he had watched at 17 what happened when the rule was applied without hesitation. So he applied it now. He gave the order quietly. He didn't raise his voice. That 2 of the senior guards stepped forward, and one of them gently took Sophia by the elbow. "Sir, please," she said, and her voice was very small. "Sir, I did not. I have never. I don't even know what those things are." "Sophia," Lorenzo said, "you will not be harmed. This is procedure. Please cooperate." The walk from the main hall to the basement was short and terrible. 2 guards ahead of her, one behind, the old cook, a stout woman named Rosa, took Emma firmly into her arms and turned the little girl's face into her shoulder so she wouldn't have to watch her mother pass. But Emma had already seen. In the narrow corridor at the bottom of the servant staircase, Sophia was allowed to stop for exactly 1 moment. Emma broke free of Rosa and ran to her. She didn't cry out loud. Her tears came in complete silence, the specific soundless weeping of a child who had long ago learned not to make noise in this house. Her small fingers wrapped around 2 of her mother's fingers, and wouldn't let go. Sophia knelt. She pressed her forehead against her daughter's forehead. She whispered something in Italian that no one else could hear. Signora, per favor, the older guard said quietly. He lifted the little girl gently away, the way a man lifts something that might break. Emma's fingers held on until the last possible instant. Then they were empty. Sophia was not permitted to turn her head as she walked the rest of the way down the corridor. The room at the far end was not a cell. It had been used in older days as a place to keep visiting relatives who didn't wish to sleep on the higher floors. There was a narrow iron bed frame with a thin mattress, one wooden chair, a small table, a single yellow bulb hanging from a wire in the ceiling. The door had a bolt on the outside. A guard was stationed on the other side of it. Sophia sat down on the edge of the bed with her back very straight and her hands folded in her lap. She didn't cry. She had used up her tears many months ago, in laundry rooms and storage closets, and once in the driver's seat of her small parked car. And there were no more left inside her tonight. That she tried slowly to think. She tried to remember what she could have done, what she could have seen, whom she could have offended. She turned over the past 2 years of her life in the house, room by room, week by week. There was nothing. She was only a housekeeper. She had never opened a safe. She had never listened at a door. She had never read a paper that wasn't a grocery list. The second day of the investigation began under a low gray sky, that Emma hadn't slept. Rosa had made her a small bed of blankets on the couch in the staff room, had sat beside her, stroking her hair until the little girl's eyes finally closed near dawn, and then had gone about her own morning duties with a heaviness in her step that everyone in the kitchen noticed and no one commented on. By the middle of the afternoon, the old woman had settled herself into the armchair by the stove for her usual half-hour rest. Within a few minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Emma waited until she was sure. Then she slid down from the couch, tucked her small stuffed rabbit under her arm, and slipped out of the staff room on quiet feet. She wanted her mother. She didn't know where they had taken her mother, only that the guards had walked her down a corridor toward the basement, and that she couldn't go into the basement because there was always someone at the door. So she did the only thing that made sense to a mind of 3 years. She would go outside into the garden where her mother sometimes sat during her breaks, and she would wait there. The back garden had grown large and confusing under the low sky. The paths curved between hedges that were taller than she was. She walked one direction. She walked another. Very quickly, she was no longer certain which way led back to the house. Then she heard voices, 2 voices, a woman's and a man's, not raised, but distinct, coming from the direction of the greenhouse at the far end of the garden. Emma moved toward the sound the way small children move toward voices in an unfamiliar place, hoping one of them might be a grown-up who knew her. As she came around the low stone bench, past the linden tree where she and Lorenzo had sat only days before, and she saw the outline of the greenhouse through the branches of a tall camellia bush that grew close against its glass wall, 2 figures stood inside among the white orchids. Emma crouched down behind the camellia. She didn't know why she crouched. Something in her body simply told her not to be seen. Through the open door of the greenhouse, the voices reached her in fragments. The cart was perfect. No one questioned it. But she has a child, Vincent. And the child, the little one, has to go too. Sooner rather than later. We can't leave her here to remember things. She is only 3. Children have very long memories. Isabella, longer than adults give them credit for. Isabella laughed then, a small, nervous laugh that didn't sound entirely like a laugh. Vincent reached out and patted her shoulder in the specific way a man pats something he has already decided is his. Emma didn't understand all of the words. She didn't know what a cart was in that sentence, or what it meant that she had to go too, or why they had said her mother's name without kindness. But she had the memory of a child who had learned to watch before she had learned to speak in full sentences, and she remembered every word exactly as it had been said. As she backed away from the bush without making a sound, turned, and began to run back toward the house, her small heart pounding hard inside her chest. Emma returned to the staff room before Rosa awoke. As she sat back down on the couch, folded her small hands in her lap, and waited. She waited through the rest of the old cook's nap. She waited through the afternoon tea. She waited until Rosa came near enough that she could tug lightly on the woman's apron. "I need to speak to Mr. Duca," Emma said quietly. Rosa blinked. "Little one, he is very busy today. I know, Emma said. But he told me once that if I ever needed him, I could tell you, and I need him now. It is important. There was something in the little girl's face that stopped the old cook from arguing. Rosa wiped her hands on her apron, walked down the corridor to the front hall, and after a few minutes returned to say that the master would see her. Emma was led up the wide staircase, along the second-floor hallway, past the closed laundry room, door she never wanted to look at again, and into Lorenzo's study on the far side of the house. The room smelled of old books and cedar. Lorenzo stood behind an enormous walnut desk, and when he saw her, he came around it at once and knelt to her level. Emma, what is it? She didn't sit down. She stood in front of the great desk, which was much taller than her head, and she began to speak in the same careful voice she had used under the linden tree. I heard something. In the greenhouse. Miss Isabella and Uncle Vincent were talking. They didn't know I was there. I hid behind the camellia bush. Lorenzo's face didn't change, but a small, cold thing moved down the length of his spine. What did they say, Emma? They said the cart was perfect. They said no one questioned it. They said, her voice grew a little smaller. They said the little one has to go too. Sooner rather than later. That is me, sir. I think they meant me. Miss Isabella asked about me, because I am only 3. Uncle Vincent said children have very long memories. Lorenzo didn't move. The cart, he repeated softly, yes, sir. Twice. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he thanked her very seriously, the way one thanks an adult. He asked Rosa to take her back to the staff room, and to stay with her personally until he sent word. He didn't react outwardly to a single thing she had said. At the moment the door closed behind the little girl, he picked up the internal phone on his desk and called only one person, not Vincent, Marco. Come to my study through the servant's stair. Alone. Do not speak to anyone on the way. 20 minutes later, in the small screening room adjacent to the study, the two of them watched the footage that Marco had pulled it directly from the storage servers, bypassing the daily review that Vincent's men normally handled. The corridor camera outside the second-floor sitting room. Thursday afternoon, 4 o'clock precisely. At 4:02, Vincent walked into frame. He didn't slow. He didn't glance around. He simply passed the unattended cart in the hallway, and in the space of 30 seconds, he bent, opened the lower compartment, placed 2 objects inside, closed it again, and continued down the corridor as though nothing at all had happened. Lorenzo watched the sequence 3 times without speaking. Late Saturday afternoon, Lorenzo walked down to the basement alone. He carried a set of keys in one hand and a small folded blanket in the other. The guard at the door of the far room straightened when he saw the boss coming, opened his mouth to speak, and then closed it again when Lorenzo made a small, quiet gesture. The bolt was drawn back. The door opened. Sophia was sitting exactly where she had been sitting for 2 days, on the edge of the narrow iron bed, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. She hadn't touched the tray of food that had been brought to her. Her eyes lifted when she heard the door, and something in her face braced for the next terrible thing. Sophia, Lorenzo said quietly. It is over. You have been cleared. She didn't understand. She stared at him. Sir, there is camera footage. Very clear. You were set up. Someone else placed those items in your cart. It was not you. It was never you. Someone else, she repeated slowly. Yes. Who? Sir, I can't tell you that yet. I need you to trust me a little longer. But I can tell you what I know for certain. You did nothing. You are free. For a long moment, she didn't move at all. The words seemed to travel toward her from a great distance and to arrive one at a time. Then, very slowly, the strength of the past 2 days went out of her shoulders. She slid from the edge of the bed into the wooden chair beside it, put both hands over her face, and finally began to cry. These were not the tears she had been hiding for months in laundry rooms and pantry closets. Those tears had been small and quick and swallowed back the moment the door opened. These tears were different. These were the tears of a woman who had held herself upright for 2 entire days on a mattress in a locked basement room, believing perhaps she would never be allowed to hold her child again, and who had just been told without warning that she could. They came out of her in long broken waves, and she couldn't stop them. Lorenzo stepped back into the corridor and gestured. Marco appeared, carrying Emma. The little girl was set down on the concrete floor. Mommy. Sophia dropped to her knees on the floor and opened her arms. Emma ran into them and held on with all the strength of a body that had spent 2 days believing its mother had disappeared forever. Neither of them said anything. They only held each other, and Sophia rocked back and forth very slightly, and Emma's small fingers gripped the back of her mother's dress the way small fingers grip a shore. Lorenzo waited until they had breathed for a little while. Then he crouched near them and spoke gently. Sophia, I am sorry. The rule required me to isolate you. I couldn't stop it, not without breaking a law older than I am. Forgive me, sir. Please. There is nothing to forgive. There is, and I ask it anyway. I need one more thing from you. Return to your work tomorrow morning. Pretend that everything is finished. Say nothing to anyone about what has happened. I need time to understand why the man I trusted most in the world wanted to destroy you. Sophia nodded. She didn't ask a single question Sunday night. Isabella couldn't sleep. She had tried from 10 in the evening onward to lie in her enormous bed under the heavy silk cover, and every time she closed her eyes, something in her chest tightened again. Vincent had been strange all day, colder, distant in a way he had never been distant with her before. He had barely looked at her at dinner. When she had passed him in the corridor outside the study, he had spoken to her only in careful public sentences, as though she were already a stranger. Something inside her, something older than her fear of Lorenzo, and older than her greed, and older than the 10 years of secret rooms and secret hotels she had shared with Vincent, was beginning to understand that she was no longer safe at 3 in the morning. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, walked out onto the small stone balcony outside her bedroom, and called him. He answered on the 4th ring. Vincent, it's late. I know. I need to talk. I can't do this anymore. I have thought about it all night. It's too much. Sophia is still in this house. The little girl is still in this house. Lorenzo suspects something. I can feel it. And if he ever finds out. Isabella, let me finish. Please. I want to stop. I want to end this. I would rather confess everything to him myself right now, tomorrow morning, than keep going. Let him take away the ring. Let him send me back to my father. Let him do whatever he wants to me. I will accept it. I will not accept another day of this. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment she was afraid he would begin to shout. She was more afraid, in a way she couldn't name, that he would not. You are right, Vincent said finally. She almost cried with relief. You are right, Isabella. This has gone too far, and I have been thinking too. There is another way. Meet me tomorrow night at the greenhouse. Bring the papers, all of them. The transfer records, the offshore documents, everything you have kept. We will leave together tomorrow before he understands anything. There is a private plane in Newark. We can be in Zurich by Tuesday morning. From there, Europe. Anywhere you want. Vincent, are you serious? I have never been more serious about anything. 10 o'clock. The greenhouse. She pressed her hand against her mouth, laughed once quietly, and said yes. She said yes 3 times. Then she went inside, closed the balcony door, and slept for the first time in 3 days in his own house across the city. Vincent set the phone down on his desk with great care that he didn't smile. He didn't react. He turned instead to the wall behind his desk, on which he had pinned a large printed map of the city, and he stood in front of it for a long time. At the center of the map, marked in red, was the Duca estate on Prospect Hill. At the far northeastern edge, in matching red, was another mansion, the compound of Don Marcello Rossi, the head of the oldest rival family in New Haven. The man whose war with the Duca line stretched back 3 generations. Unbroken, unhealed, waiting only for a single spark, Isabella was Don Marcello's only daughter. If she died inside the Duca estate, and every piece of evidence pointed to Lorenzo, war between the 2 greatest empires in the city would be certain within 24 hours. Vincent would stand outside of it. He would let them tear each other apart. And when the smoke cleared, he would walk quietly into what remained of both houses and take them. Monday night arrived cold and windless up by 11. The estate had gone quiet in the specific deep way it went quiet only late in the week. When the guards on the outer wall had settled into their long shifts and the household staff had turned out most of the lights, Isabella slipped from her bedroom in a long black coat over her dress, a dark scarf wrapped around her hair, and a small leather bag pressed close to her side. Inside the bag were the papers Vincent had asked for, transfer receipts, offshore account codes, every document she had kept over the past 5 years, hidden inside the false back of her jewelry drawer. She carried them now the way a woman carries something she is very tired of holding as she followed the garden path along the side of the house, past the linden tree, past the low stone bench, all the way to the greenhouse at the far end of the property. He was already there. Vincent stood inside among the tall white orchids in a dark coat of his own. And when she pushed the glass door open, he crossed the space in 3 long strides and gathered her into his arms. You came. I came. You were right, Isabella. You were right about all of it. This is the only way. I have been thinking about nothing else all day. About you, about us, about the life we can finally have. He kissed her forehead. He kissed the side of her neck. He murmured her name against her hair, but she let herself, for the first time in a very long time, believe him. He held her at arm's length, smiled at her the way he had first smiled at her 10 years ago, and then he kissed her mouth. It was a long kiss, warm, familiar. It felt to her like a beginning. Then, without any warning at all, his hands moved. There was a single sharp intake of breath. A stumble backward. A pot of white orchids struck the stone floor and shattered into ceramic pieces. The scarf slipped from her hair. Her leather bag fell open at her feet, papers scattering. Her breath came once more, faster. Then again. Then a third time, thinner and further apart. And then the greenhouse was quiet again, and the only sound was the small pattering of loose orchid petals settling around a body that had stopped moving. Vincent stood very still for perhaps 10 seconds. Then, calmly, methodically, the way a man performs a task he has rehearsed in his mind 100 times, he began to build the scene. From an inner pocket, he produced a thin silicone shell shaped precisely to the pads of Lorenzo's right hand. He had made it that afternoon from the whiskey glass Lorenzo had left on the study desk after lunch. He pressed the false prints, one by one, in the correct places along the side of Isabella's throat. Next, a small piece of pale blue fabric, torn earlier from one of Lorenzo's older shirts, taken from the dressing room while the boss was in a meeting. He dropped it beside her in a way that would look natural to any investigator. Then, from a second pocket, a small burner phone containing a cloned copy of Lorenzo's SIM. He opened the messaging application, and he sent, at a timestamp adjusted to 10 the previous evening, a single threatening line to Isabella's phone, which now lay near the fallen bag. He left through the side door of the greenhouse, along the service path behind the hedge. No one saw him. Tuesday morning arrived pale and cold. At 7, the old gardener, a man named Bruno, who had tended the Duca grounds for over 30 years, walked down the path from the tool shed with his watering can in one hand and a pair of pruning shears in the other. He pushed the greenhouse door open with his shoulder the way he had every morning for 3 decades, hummed a short line of something under his breath, and took 2 steps inside. Then he saw her. The scream that came out of him was not the scream of a young man. It was the raw, torn sound of an old man who had lived a long life and had never, in all of it, walked into a morning like this one. He dropped the watering can. It rolled across the stone floor. Within 30 seconds, Vincent, who had been waiting since dawn, dressed, alert, sitting in the small sunroom off the kitchen with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, came running down the garden path with an expression of perfectly rehearsed horror. He was the first to reach the greenhouse. He was the first to see her, or to appear to see her for the second time. He was the first to run back up the path, shouting for the guards. And he was the one who called Lorenzo directly. By 7:30, the family's private security had sealed the greenhouse behind a screen of black canvas. No local police were called. This was not a matter for the state. This was a matter for the world beneath the state. And in that world, the news traveled faster than any siren. By 9 in the morning, every family from Boston to Philadelphia had heard it. The only daughter of Don Marcello Rossi had been murdered inside the Duca estate. Every piece of evidence pointed to Lorenzo Duca himself. Across the city, in the old Rossi compound on the northeastern edge of New Haven, the phone in Don Marcello's study rang at 9:04. But he listened. He said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he lifted the empty bottle of red wine from the corner of his desk and drove it into the tall mirror above the fireplace with the whole strength of a body that had only a moment before still felt young. Glass fell in a long, slow rain around his feet. He didn't move to step away from it. Tears ran down the sides of his face, silent and unstoppable on a face that hadn't wept in front of another human being in 40 years. He was 60. He had lost a wife. He had buried a brother. He had never wept. He picked up the phone again with a hand that had begun to shake and gave the order to mobilize every soldier the family had at the Duca estate. Lorenzo stood in the front hall and faced the bitter shape of what had been done to him. Every scrap of evidence in the greenhouse pointed at his own hand. The fingerprints, the torn fabric, the threatening message from his own number. Even the men in his own house, who had served his father, were beginning to look at him with the specific, careful confusion of soldiers who didn't know what to believe. Vincent stood at his shoulder, voice low, voice concerned, voice full of a false gentleness. "Boss, Rossi will come by nightfall. You have to move first. You have to strike before he does." Lorenzo turned his head very slowly and looked at Vincent for a long moment. He said nothing at all. That the staff quarters had been sealed off from the rest of the estate since morning. Sophia had been told nothing. Marco had come to the door of the small back kitchen at 7 and had said only that no one was to leave the servants' wing until further notice, that no phones were to be used, that no questions were to be asked. Rosa had crossed herself and said nothing. The younger housemaids had huddled at the corner table with their tea going cold. Sophia had gone about her work in the small linens room, without knowing that the woman who had spent so many months insulting her was already lying dead, or believed to be. At the far end of the garden, Emma had heard the guards moving in the hallway all day. She had heard the running footsteps outside the kitchen window at first light. She had heard the strange quiet that followed. And she had not slept. At midnight, she slipped out of the small cot beside her mother's bed, put on her coat over her nightgown, and walked down the servants' corridor and out into the garden. Sophia woke 20 minutes later and found the bed emptied as she didn't scream. She didn't call for anyone. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, took a small flashlight from the drawer, and went out the same door her daughter had used. The garden was very quiet under the cold moon. She followed the path along the side of the house, past the linden tree, past the low stone bench, whispering her daughter's name into the darkness. At the far end of the path, the greenhouse rose up and silvered. She saw at once that the door was hanging slightly open, and that the black canvas screens the guards had put up had been taken down again, because the investigators had believed their work there was already done. As she stepped inside to look for Emma, the moonlight came down through the glass roof in long pale bars. In the center of the greenhouse floor, among the shards of a broken orchid pot and the scattered pale petals, a shape was lying very still. Sophia stopped breathing. That it was Isabella. As she moved forward on legs, she couldn't entirely feel. She knelt down. In the space of the few seconds it took her to lower her hand, an entire long film ran through her mind. Every insult, every spilled glass of red wine, every corner she had scrubbed 7 times, every whispered ugly word, every hour she had hidden in a small room to cry. But Sophia Marchetti had never, in her life, been the kind of woman who could refuse a body its next breath. She placed her fingers carefully against the side of Isabella's throat. There was a pulse. Faint, unsteady but there. Isabella was still alive. Sophia understood in the same instant exactly what that meant. If Vincent ever learned that his victim was still breathing, he would come back to finish what he had begun. As she reached into the pocket of her shawl for her phone and dialed the only number she knew outside the Duca house at Dr. Antonio Ferrari, a quiet man who had been in the family's debt for 7 years, since the night Lorenzo pulled him out of a burning car after an explosion in the Port District. He came in an unmarked ambulance within the hour and drove Isabella through the sleeping countryside to St. Catherine's Convent, hidden in the low hills outside Springfield. Sophia found Emma asleep beneath the stone bench under the linden tree, curled around her small stuffed rabbit. The next 3 days moved along 2 entirely separate tracks. At the Duca estate, Lorenzo worked in complete silence. He gathered every scrap of evidence he could pull without Vincent noticing. He cross-checked every ledger. He met privately with Marco in a small cottage on the far side of the property that Vincent had never had reason to know about. He let Vincent believe he was breaking under the weight. He let Vincent stand at his shoulder and murmur again and again that Rossi would come, that they had to strike first, that a war was already inevitable. Lorenzo said only that he needed a few more days. Vincent smiled, patient, and pressed him outside the estate. Along a small back road that wound north through the low hills of central Connecticut, Sophia drove every evening after her shift. She carried a small basket. Inside the basket was a jar of broth she had made herself at midnight the night before, a small paper bag of medicine Dr. Ferrari had left for her, and a change of linens. She told Rosa she was visiting a great aunt in the countryside who had fallen ill. Rosa asked no questions. The old cook had begun, quietly, to suspect that Sophia was carrying more than a basket, and she had decided that whatever it was not her business. St. Catherine's Convent lay at the end of a long dirt lane behind an iron gate the sisters kept unlocked at night for Sophia to Dr. Ferrari met her at the door on the first 2 evenings. The patient, he said, is breathing. Nothing more. On the 3rd evening, he simply stepped aside and let her go up the narrow wooden staircase to the small room at the top. Isabella was awake. She had opened her eyes perhaps 20 minutes before. She was staring up at the low wooden beams. When Sophia stepped into the room and set the basket down on the small table by the bed, Isabella turned her head slowly, and the moment she saw who it was, her eyes filled with water. Not from physical pain, from something else, from shock, from the specific, unbearable weight of the woman she had insulted for months being the woman who had chosen to save her life. Isabella began to cry. She cried for 10 minutes without being able to say a single word. Sophia sat down in the chair by the bed and waited. She didn't touch her. She didn't speak. She only waited when the words finally came. They came all at once that Isabella told her everything that the affair with Vincent, 10 years long, older than her engagement. The money, the shell companies, the plan to plant the notebook in Sophia's cart. And finally, in a whisper, the last part. That she had been the bait for a war Vincent had wanted to start between 2 families, for reasons she now understood he had never fully shared with her. Then she told Sophia the one thing Sophia herself didn't yet know. 7 months ago, Isabella said. The old study on the 4th floor. Do you remember cleaning it one afternoon? Lorenzo had already moved to the 2nd floor rooms, and no one used it anymore. You came in with your cart. You saw us. You looked in for less than 2 seconds. And then you walked away as if you hadn't seen anything. But we knew we couldn't touch you then, because you belonged to Lorenzo. If you disappeared, he would investigate at once. So we chose the slower way. We tried, month by month, to break you until you left on your own. Sophia sat very still. For a very long time. She didn't move. If she had suffered for months over something she didn't even remember seeing. Isabella reached forward and took her hand and apologized in a voice that had shattered into pieces too small to gather. 3 more days passed. At the abandoned Eastport of New Haven lay quiet at 5 in the morning, wrapped in a thick fog that had rolled in from the sound during the night. Between the rusted cargo cranes and the long dark water, 2 lines of men stood facing each other across a wide stretch of cracked concrete. On one side, Lorenzo Duca with 30 of his guards. Long coats, hands inside their coats, breath visible in the cold air. On the other side, Don Marcello Rossi with 40 of his own, his face carved out of exhaustion and grief, his eyes rimmed with the specific red of a father who hadn't slept in 5 nights. Between the 2 lines, only fog and silence. Vincent stood at Lorenzo's shoulder, wearing the last of his loyalty like a well-tailored coat. Don Marcello took 2 slow steps forward. He lifted his right hand into the air, preparing to give the order that would begin a war 3 generations in the making. At that exact moment, the side door of the warehouse behind Lorenzo slid open. Sophia stepped out first. And leaning on her arm, pale, one wrist still bandaged, but standing on her own 2 feet, was Isabella. Every man on both sides of the concrete went completely still. Don Marcello's hand dropped to his side. The color left his face until he looked as gray as the fog around him. Isabella walked slowly forward, 1 careful step at a time, until she stood in the empty space between the 2 lines of armed men. She raised her arm. Her hand was shaking. She pointed one trembling finger directly at Vincent Corsi. Then, in a voice that was thin but perfectly clear, she began to speak. That she told them about the affair, 10 years of it. She told them about the money. Tens of millions of dollars moved out of the Duca family through shell companies in 3 cities. She told them about the notebook in Sophia's cart. She told them about the night in the greenhouse and the false fingerprints and the cloned phone. And finally, in the same steady, thin voice, she told them the last part. That Vincent had planned all of it, not for love and not for wealth, but to ignite a war between the 2 greatest families in New Haven, so that when both houses had finished destroying each other, he could walk into the ruins and take them. Vincent turned to run, that he made it perhaps 5 steps before the soldiers of both families closed around him. Lorenzo walked forward through the fog and dropped a thick folder onto the concrete at Vincent's feet. Transaction records. Warehouse camera footage. Photographs from a hidden camera at the rear door of the greenhouse on Monday night. He had been building it silently all week. 15 years of betrayal collapsed inside 3 minutes. Don Marcello looked at his daughter. He crossed the space between them in long, unsteady strides and gathered her into his arms. And for the first time in 40 years, the old Don wept in front of other men. He held her for a long time. Then he turned to Lorenzo and lowered his head in the specific deep bow of a man who had almost destroyed the wrong enemy. That he apologized. He extended his hand. Lorenzo took it. 3 generations of blood between the Duca and Rossi families ended in a single quiet handshake in the fog. Isabella turned to Sophia. In front of every soldier on that concrete, she bowed her head. And in a voice broken into pieces, she apologized. She would leave with her father that same morning, back to Providence, and she would answer to her own family for what she had done. She would never enter Lorenzo's life again. Lorenzo turned last to Sophia. For the first time in his entire life, the boss of the Duca family lowered his head to a housekeeper. He apologized for not having seen her pain sooner. He apologized for the 2 days in the basement. He apologized for every insult she had swallowed in silence under his roof. Then he unclipped the heavy ring of keys that had once belonged to the old head housekeeper, and he placed it into her hands, head of the entire household. Authority over every servant, every schedule, every internal budget of the estate. Emma came running across the concrete between the guards who had already lowered their weapons, and she threw her small arms around her mother's legs. If there are conspiracies built across 15 years by the sharpest minds in the underworld, and there are truths spoken by a 3-year-old child in 6 simple words, that single sentence didn't only save a single mother. It saved 2 empires. And it stopped a war that would have run in rivers through the streets of an entire city. The life lesson is this. Sometimes the smallest observer under a roof is the one who sees most clearly what is truly happening beneath it. The people we consider too young to understand are very often the people who have been quietly understanding everything all along. Now the question is for you. Have you ever heard something important from a child that the grown-ups around you overlooked or brushed aside? Please tell your story in the comments below. This channel was built for the sharing of exactly those small, honest moments, and every single comment is read. If this story touched something in you today, please tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that hidden tears are always seen by someone eventually. New stories are uploaded here every day, and your support is what allows them to keep being told. To every single one of you watching right now, wherever you are in the world, may you and everyone you love be blessed with good health, with peace inside your home, with joyful and gentle days, and with ears soft enough to hear the quiet weeping around you before it grows any heavier. Until then, take care of yourselves. Take care of the small watchers in your own homes.